Hello and welcome to DGT Podcast Languages and Technology, brought to you by the European Commission's Translation Department. I am Anna Holmén, and for this episode I am joined by Isabelle Augenstein, Professor at Copenhagen University at the Department of Computer Science. Welcome to the podcast, Isabelle.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
We have had a bit of a mini-series on AI on the podcast with two earlier guests speaking on the subject. First, we had Miguel de Batista, one of the prompt engineers in the European Commission, and then Marina Pancheva, who gave us her view from the language industry. And today we will get an academic perspective. As we are all encountering large language models in one format or the other, in our lives and at work, we all need to be aware both of how to reap the benefits and how to avoid the risks. So, Isabelle, before we get into the research you do on natural language processing and large language models, I am curious to hear your language story. How did you first become interested in languages, and how did it take you to where you are now?
Interesting question. As far as I can remember, I've always been quite interested in languages already at school. I was learning English, French, and Spanish at school. And I think I was always quite good at learning languages. That probably helped with being interested in language learning. And then I also learned some other languages privately. I learned Swedish, Danish. I tried to learn Russian at university, but that didn't go so well. And then I more recently learned Korean through self-study. So yeah, that's how it all started. And then I ended up studying computational linguistics, which is a combination of linguistics and computer science. And it's partly because I was still interested in sciences as well. And one of my friends found this program and it sounded really interesting. Almost like science fiction back then, but things have changed a lot since.
So you really managed to find a way to combine your interest in languages and the science.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great story. So before we discuss your research, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, could you just give us a reminder of what it is that large language models do, so that is clear before we hear more about the research?
Yes, of course. So language models at their core, they predict a sequence of words based on the history of words in the context. So this is often called a prompt these days. And they do that by using a statistical model of what words follow one another, which they've observed based on reading, observing, memorizing lots and lots of data. And large language models these days, they're variants of language models. What they do in addition is they have this chatbot feature. So this means that the history of words isn't just a normal history of words like one would see in ordinary text, but there can also be commands or questions. And this is done through a step called fine-tuning, specifically also instruction fine-tuning, where the language models are given these prompts, this history of text, then they generate some text, and the language models are used to generate different variants of text, and then users rank them based on their utility for answering a specific question or executing a specific task.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but now please tell us about your current research focus.
So, my overarching research focus is within fair and accountable natural language processing. And within large language models, what I'm most interested in is this issue of factuality and faithfulness. Language models are very good at predicting the next most likely word, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what they predict is factually correct with respect to what we know to be true in the real world. Also, they sometimes make things up if they're asked, if they're given a prompt that they not don't feel comfortable dealing with. Maybe that's not the best way of putting it, but they can be that the prompt can be something that's not within their domain expertise.
Is
So
this the famous hallucination?
yes, it can be hallucinations, correct. But it can also be that they're asked to translate, for example, from one language to another. They don't have so many training examples for the specific language. And so then they make stuff up. They hallucinate in order to please the user because that's how they're trained.
And what are the different ways, different problems you have with large language models? What you need to look out for and be aware of that it can happen apart from hallucination?
Mm. So one issue is, of course, factuality and faithfulness, and related to that is prompt instability. So that means that language models are trained with specific prompts, and these prompts they will be familiar with. But then there are also other ways of formulating the same requests, which will be synonymous with them, but the language models will not have seen them during training. And then the answers will be less likely to be correct, but that's not something that an end user will be able to see or question. They will just get an answer, and the answer might be a true or false, all right, or correct or incorrect. And that means that if a user doesn't have domain expertise in the specific area, it will be very difficult for them to evaluate if the answer is correct or incorrect. And that's really problematic because LLMs are specifically useful or especially useful for areas where a user lacks some kind of knowledge, where they would like their personal knowledge to be augmented with by an LLM. So that I find quite problematic.
Yeah, exactly. If you already know it, then you can evaluate it, but then you already know it. But of course, it can be helpful anyway to get it written down. You mentioned that the LLM wants to please the user, and the expression for that is sycophancy. I'm wondering a little bit, do we know how this has, because for me it doesn't really link to predicting the next word. Why is this something that the LLM does? Do we know that?
Yes, so that's something that happens during the instruction fine-tuning process, where there's a prompt and the models have to provide a reply, and users then rank the replies. And if the replies are useful to the people ranking them, then they will be ranked very highly. Whereas if they're not, then they will not. And because the LLMs are then fine-tuned on these preferences, that leads to this phenomenon of sycophancy.
Oh, okay, so it kind of learns that, or it just rates it higher.
Exactly.
If
Yes.
if I try to avoid using words that gives it some kind of human aspect.
Yes.
Those are a few of the things that are inherent in an LLM, which we need to look out for. But there are also ways that external actor can do to insert, fiddle with the model, so to say. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So one phenomenon is called LLM grooming, where the web is flooded with false information. And then this false information enters the LLM in different ways. So one way is it can enter the LLM at the LLM training stage because LLMs are trained on data from the web, amongst other things. And they require a lot of data for training. So the filtering stage, the data filtering stage, is often not that rigorous because they really optimize for having a lot of data. The other one is after an LLM is trained, something called a retrieval augmented generation is often done. And that means that in order for the LLM to be up to date, the knowledge that an LLM has obtained during training is augmented with more recent data from the web that's retrieved before the generation is made. So, as when the request by the user is performed, data is retrieved, additional web pages are retrieved, and they augment the knowledge that an LLM has before the final answer is then produced.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a lot of things to keep in mind and to be aware of when you use LLMs or use the output to see if it works for what you need it for. Is there a way of measuring an LLM to measure the quality of it? How is that done, and does it work?
Yes, so there are many benchmarks for measuring the performance of LLMs, and they're typically measured for things like reading comprehension, math skills, coding, and other such tasks. And sycophancy is also something that is being tracked, and prompt instability. And the models are getting better and better with respect to these metrics, but even the more recent models aren't perfect. So they will always have these kinds of downsides, and one will always have to be conscious of the potential issues that I mentioned.
And if we come back to this that I was mentioning before, try to avoid that you see it as a human because it's so seductive when you get all this text out. It's very difficult to not see it as, actually thinking. Do you have any suggestions how you should see your LLM or your chatbot, how you th should think about it?
Well, a lot of people think of a chatbot as an assistant, as a personal assistant, and it's also very useful at being an assistant. But I think it's important to try to keep in mind that it has these quite severe limitations. So even though it displays some kind of level of intelligence, it doesn't have the kind of intelligence and creativity that humans have, so that it can store a lot of data, it can apply some patterns that it's already seen, but it can't be creative in its own right in the way that humans are. And then when having these longer conversations with LLMs, it also becomes apparent that they forget over the course of a conversation. So examples are maybe you write do this or that, and you found some kind of pattern that works for I don't know what the data transformation or coding, and then you put in the request, do the same thing again. It might be that the LLM then completely misunderstands or just can't perform it because the conversational thread has been too long. Whereas for a human, it wouldn't be a problem to recall what happened 2 seconds ago. So these are some examples where one can quite clearly observe that one is talking to an AI agent rather than a human,
Yeah,
right?
so the LLM it's so much better than human beings in some aspects, so we're kind of tend to think that it also knows other things that are maybe simple for us. And sometimes it can look creative, but that's kind of then more accidental. Has been some talk about the actual intelligent LLMs being around the corner. What is your prediction for that?
Well, so the big AI companies have been talking about this for a long time, that general artificial intelligence is just around the corner. But I would say that in recent times, the discourse has shifted quite a bit from general AI to more pedestrian AI, maybe more useful AI, I would say, with in more traditional markets. So, for example, applying AI for shopping, personalized shopping, applying it for to coding, meeting summarization, enterprise search, and so on. So there was, for example, an announcement a few weeks ago that OpenAI is targeting the shopping market now. And I think this change in framing is something that will continue as companies realize they actually have to make a profit. They can't talk about AI finding a cure for cancer. They have to have come with something that's a bit more tangible as well to please their shareholders and to actually make a profit.
Okay, so
Mm.
it's more the task-based kind of use of it.
Yes.
Yes, which incidentally we are also offering from DD Translation. I can mention that. That's a little side note. The task-based, AI-based services that you can find via our website. Um, and all these weaknesses with LLMs, is it getting any better? Are there ways to improve the models?
Yes, absolutely. And since you mentioned task-specific models, some issues can be improved quite a bit by training more task-specific models. For example, this issue of them not being very good at knowledge in certain domains. If they're trained on data within these domains, of course, they improve. And the more narrow an LLM is, the better it can be at some things. Though there's a trade-off between that, because by learning lots of different tasks, learning to perform well at lots of different tasks, the LLM can also perform well at more niche tasks. But to some degree, having more domain-specific LLMs can improve the performance within these domains. Yes. One thing I would perhaps add is that these LLM companies or these AI companies, they're mainly targeting things that are of commercial value, but there are topics that are not so well aligned with their commercial interests, and that includes, for example, performance on low resource languages or knowledge within low resource cultures. So there will always be interesting topics for people to explore in academia as well. So even though AI has become a very, very popular area, I would say it's not just something for people to explore in industry, but a lot more research in academia is also still required.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for listening to DDT Podcast, Languages and Technology. Stay in touch and share your thoughts and questions on Instagram or Facebook at Translating for Europe. Don't forget to subscribe in your preferred podcast app to stay updated on EU multilingualism and translation topics. Until next time.